So first of all, I'd like to invite Mark Crowell from the University of Virginia. He's going to set the scene for us from a university perspective and really explain how the universities play such a critical role in the area of the innovative ecosystem. Mark is an associate VP and executive director for innovation at the University of Virginia, and he has extensive knowledge of technology licensing, of startups, of economic development, and the training of researchers. So quite an interesting area of work. And he also serves as co-chair of BIO, BIO's Technology Transfer Committee, and many of you will be familiar with BIO based in the United States. So without further ado, Mark, over to you. And what we'll do afterwards is we'll let the three presentations run, and then we'll open for Q&A, and you can ask any of the presenters any questions that you may have. Thanks very much. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. It's my first time attending these sessions, although I have worked with WIPO in the past as a longtime technology transfer practitioner and a former president of the Association of University Technology Managers. But it's the first time I've been in these sessions, and I find them to be extremely invigorating and quite exciting. So I'm honored to be with you and look forward to this interaction. As Andrew said in his introductory remarks, I want to start by setting the stage for effective university-industry collaborations as an increasingly important source of biopharma innovation writ large, so natural products and beyond, I think increasingly depend upon productive and constructive university-industry interactions. I also want to describe the increasingly important role and risk that universities are being asked to take on given changes in the marketplace that are affecting the way innovation makes it through the pipeline. I do want to focus my remarks as I can on natural products in particular, since that is the focus of this session. And finally, I want to spend a few minutes describing what I believe are the key characteristics of an innovation ecosystem in which universities, companies, investors, NGOs, and others coexist, and where keeping a very delicate balance in terms of the roles of all the players is really a critical factor. Okay, as I mentioned, I want to start by setting the stage for the increasingly important role of universities in establishing the biopharma ecosystem. In 2006 alone, in the US, universities launched more than 550 startup companies, about 2/3 of which were in the biopharma space, the biotech space. For those of you who follow the evolution of knowledge-based industries around the world, you know that increasingly major industry, and particularly biopharma companies, are acquiring their new pipeline from universities. So I would argue that the university's role in the ecosystem is increasingly important. In fact, if you look at statistics, they show that a vast majority of biologics on the market were developed with university input. If you look at the patent citations, the top 20 biotech patenting entities in the US 2 years ago were dominated by universities, and all of the most cited biotech patents came from academia. So I think these statistics and observations begin to show the extremely important role that academic research, basic science discovery plays in creating new knowledge assets that can be translated into innovations that drive the economy, new products, new services, and new jobs. I think further, if you continue to look at the dynamic in biopharma companies, you see that in many such cases, sorry, pharma colleagues, your pipelines are drying up. Since 1980, large biopharma companies' share of new FDA-approved drugs in the US has declined dramatically. And obviously the gap has been addressed by university-derived innovations. Several surveys were done recently of pharma execs showing that many such executives are actively looking for new models and new opportunities to collaborate with universities. Major pharma is developing totally new approaches to long-term, multifaceted strategic partnerships with universities to fill up their pipeline. And furthermore, if you look at the markets, you know that as the biopharma industry themselves and venture capital move increasingly downstream, and in fact, I observed yesterday to a group of colleagues that 10 years ago, a strong patent, an entrepreneurially minded researcher, and a halfway decent business plan would get you $2 million in venture capital. Today, to get 500 to $1 million in venture capital in the US, you have to pretty much be close to the clinic and maybe even close to producing revenues. So the landscape has changed. The gap between basic discovery and market and investment possibilities has widened greatly, and universities are faced with the requirement that they develop new pathways, new mechanisms to try to bridge that gap and move their innovations into the pipeline. Thus, I would argue that it's critical as we think about new regulations, new policies, new approaches to managing these assets and these partnerships, that we look at their potential for slowing down or adding risk or uncertainty to a process that's already full of risk and uncertainty. I've included 2 obligatory slides. I think my colleague from Novartis has a similar slide further illustrating the challenge in getting new biotech inventions, compounds, discoveries to the marketplace. This is a well-known industry diagram here that shows that 10,000 compounds in the beginning, 1 will make it into a new medicine, and that process takes 14 years or more typically. In the university setting, the rule of thumb, everyone thinks that we're always on the cusp of major revenue. The rule of thumb in universities in the US, based on 25 years of practice, is there is a 12 to 15 year time frame between discovery and revenue. That's how long all of these regulatory proof of concept and additional processes take. And so again, the idea of layering additional steps on that don't add real value to the innovation is problematic, to say the least. A second sort of obligatory slide is simply a slide showing how much R&D is invested for each new product. About $40 billion over that process is what it costs to drive this R&D engine that produces the discoveries that become the innovations. So again, what I'm trying to paint for you is a picture of a highly risky, resource-intensive process that's, frankly, the deck is stacked against most promising innovations. And our job as universities and our corporate and venture capital and startup company partners is to lower those risk barriers and accelerate promising discoveries toward the clinic by partnering effectively and by addressing risk wherever we can. If you move into the natural product space, there's some additional factors that I think influence our discussion today. Clearly, there's been a great deal of historic success in the natural products arena in terms of identifying promising new compounds for market applications. Natural products libraries are extremely well known as offering a diversity of leads not typically found in synthetic chemical libraries. So many advantages do exist that show the attractiveness of working in the natural products area. But along with those, there are also some additional challenges or risk factors, including longer discovery timelines, complexities in sourcing and in large-scale production, other challenges in patenting and regulatory schemes that we often must comply with, and of course, as we contemplate uncertain disclosure requirements, we think about additional risk and additional uncertainty adding to this process. So a promising area where universities and their industry partners can indeed create a lot of value, yes, for the companies, but certainly for patients, for society, and for the economies that we're all trying to drive with our innovation. How have universities responded to become more valuable partners and more critical members of the innovation ecosystem team, especially in the natural products area? If you look around the landscape 10 years ago, The typical modus operandi in a university was a professor would disclose a promising invention. We would perhaps file a patent if we felt it was of interest, and we would hope that Frank Peterson or someone from industry would come knocking on our door and say they'd like to license it. Today, in order to address this development gap and lower the risk factors that we've talked about, universities are actively embracing and moving into what I would call the translational or proof of concept research process in an aggressive way and in a very effective way. In many institutions, you're finding the installation of screening and drug development capabilities, medicinal chemistry units, other kinds of facilities and resources designed to fail fast or grow fast with new discoveries, new compounds that may have market and clinical potential. In places where these types of resources are not possible to literally build within the institution, many universities are creating networks of virtual contacts, virtual resources in order to address these development gaps so that they can do a better job of de-risking early stage compounds and discoveries. What's also happening at the university landscape level is that funding agencies, ranging from federal government agencies in the US and increasingly to nonprofit patient advocacy groups, are actually requiring universities to engage in this space more effectively in order to accelerate new treatments toward the clinic. So many universities are responding and thus becoming more high-value partners to industry. New models of collaboration are growing up all the time. At the University of Virginia, we have a multi-year, multi-million-dollar partnership with AstraZeneca in the cardiovascular research space. AstraZeneca didn't come in and fund just one project here and one project there. We work together on an annual basis to define a scope of work and offer a RFP process for our faculty to apply for funding. Each faculty is teamed with an AstraZeneca scientist. Our graduate students and postdocs do internships at AZ in Sweden. AZ scientists visit us regularly, give seminars, and in fact, have had a scientist embedded in our cardiovascular research center for over a year. Again, 5 to 10 years ago, you would never have seen that sort of partnership in a US university. So the landscape is changing extremely dramatically. Furthermore, universities are engaging much more aggressively in entrepreneurial and economic development activities. This is because most of us live in states or regions where the knowledge economy is considered the key to our future economic well-being. Furthermore, this is the way in which our innovations often have the best chance of making it through that early stage, high-risk discovery and translation process. And as I mentioned, the statistics show very clearly that big pharma and other large industry are increasingly looking to acquire or to partner with startup companies in order to get access to pipeline. How am I doing on time? Okay. So universities, I would argue, are well positioned in general in the biopharma space, but particularly in the natural product space, to act as an honest broker in the natural product and biopharma development and translation process. We have the resources, we have the mission, and increasingly we have the wherewithal in order to be aggressively engaged in high-value partners. Lastly, let me address the issue of academic culture change and how it affects this process. Many universities in the US, and I'm guessing in other countries of the world that I simply just don't know as well, are facing what we call the graying of our faculty. At most universities that I'm familiar with in the US, we look out, companies look at patent cliffs, we look at retirement cliffs. We see our top scientists retiring by the dozens over the next 5 to 10 years. And increasingly, the up-and-coming talent, the star scientists of the future, actually are indicating they want to come to places that do this well. And they expect this to be a key feature of the university's academic landscape. Furthermore, they not only want to see their technology developed where possible and hopefully to produce some economic benefit, but we're told by them, and I actually do believe it, most of them are far more interested and the opportunity to better society than the thought that they might make money. 10 years ago, they thought it was a ticket to become rich. They know the statistics. They know the 15-year cycle. They know that less than 10 universities in the U.S. even break even. But they also know that these types of programs are making it possible to create a lot of value around the university's research assets and potentially to create new products, drugs, and services to serve patients. I want to speak for a minute about the critical role of intellectual property in creating an ecosystem where these activities can occur productively. In the U.S., of course, many of you are probably familiar with our system, which is predicated on the Bayh-Dole Act, which was passed in 1980, which was the first time that universities were allowed to own patent rights developed with federal government funding. The goal of Bayh-Dole, which surprises many people, was not to make money, even though it does address how we should invest revenue if we receive it. We must share with the inventor. We're allowed to recover our costs of licensing, but we must reinvest the remainder in our research and development programs. But the real underpinning of Bayh-Dole was to address the increasing concern of our Congress that the R&D pipeline that the citizens have been investing in over the decades was not terribly productive and was not leading to U.S. competitiveness. So producing a societal and economic benefit was clearly an underpinning of the Bayh-Dole Act and thus continues to drive the activities of universities in this space. I should mention that Bayh-Dole does require a certain amount of disclosure to the federal government of our inventions. We're required to grant a government use license to the federal government, but none of the Bayh-Dole regulations read or affect the patent status. So it's real critical to understand that universities' compliance or lack thereof with Bayh-Dole doesn't affect the patent. This policy framework, and I know many of your countries have similar policies or are moving toward Bayh-Dole-like frameworks, are what allows us to give exclusive licenses to companies. And as we all know in the biotech space, particularly exclusive licensing is critical because of the long-term nature of the return on investment and the high monetary value of the investment that's required to move products toward market. It provides flexibilities in how we deal with financial terms in licensing. We're not required to charge exorbitant royalties. We're encouraged by our universities to try to receive fair value, but we simply can give the technology away if we wish. So there's a misconception that Bayh-Dole actually requires us to drive a high-priced deal. We seek, in all cases at the University of Virginia, to receive fair compensation for the value of our technology. So clearly, the comment I want to make in summary on this slide is the importance of an IP system, of strong patents, and of an IP ownership and development framework that allows us to gain control of these assets and to maintain clarity and focus as we develop these assets for future partnering so that we can give clear title and a strong license to our partners. So in closing, let me just talk about the critical components that I see for an innovation ecosystem and the university's ability to contribute in a high-value way to that ecosystem. I think strong patents, where there's predictability and certainty involved, is required, particularly in the biotech space. I think strong science, our governments must continue to invest in basic science. Our corporate partners and our foundation and not-for-profit sponsors need to partner to provide flexible funding for translational or proof of concept work. Capital is increasingly important because of the high cost and the late stage with which biopharma companies tend to want to acquire these assets. So connecting with angel and venture capital is a critical part of the ecosystem. Talent, founders and employees for these new companies, investors and advisors to help them grow, are all critical components of a strong ecosystem in the biopharma space, and I would argue form the basis in large part of the benefits that are received from these partnerships. And finally, industry partners and collaborators at the end of the day are required for many of the reasons that I've mentioned. So I look forward to participating in the rest of this discussion and to answering questions at the end of this session. Thank you for your attention.